Most Americans are familiar with the refrain, "No taxation without representation." What many Americans may not be aware of is that the residents of Washington, D.C. are in fact subject to taxation without representation. Numbering more than 700,000, the residents of Washington, D.C. pay federal taxes, yet have no votes in Congress. Currently, D.C. only has a non-voting representative in the House of Reps, and it has no representatives in the Senate, limiting D.C.'s autonomy. Additionally, rights given to states, like the autonomous passage of state laws, do not apply to D.C. Congressional approval must be granted to D.C.'s mayor before any D.C. law is put into effect, and Congress has the ability to change any of D.C.'s local laws, which is not the case for any of the 50 states. Supporters of D.C. statehood point out that Washington, D.C. carries out most state functions, and it also has departments for education, health, and more, yet it isn't afforded all of the rights that states are granted. For example, unlike states, which have the power to select judges for their courts, D.C. courts have judges appointed by the President of the United States. D.C. does not have the power to select the judges in its own courts. Because of the inequity between those who live in D.C. and those who live in the rest of the United States, many D.C. residents have been motivated to push for D.C. to become a state. According to statehood.dc.gov, the official D.C. statehood website, the most ideal plan would be to shrink the size of the federal district and encompass the current population of the district into a new state named after abolitionist Frederick Douglass, called Washington Douglas Commonwealth. Alternate ideas have been to combine parts of D.C. with Virginia or Maryland in order to give D.C. residents the benefit of being parts of states. But, while viable, these plans are not as popular with the people of D.C. The most recent attempt to make D.C. an official state took place in April of 2021, when the House of Representatives approved a bill for D.C. statehood, 216 votes to 208. The vote was split among political party lines, as D.C. is mainly composed of Democrat voters. The mayor of D.C., Mayor Muriel Bowser, has used racial justice as a reason for D.C. statehood, given that D.C. would be the only state with a majority black population. Nonetheless, the bill has not made it past the Senate, so it seems D.C. won't be becoming a state anytime soon. For now, D.C. residents will continue being taxed without being fully represented in Congress. Now, proponents of D.C. statehood have drawn comparisons between D.C. and American colonies under British rule, and indeed, the American Revolutionary War was fought in large part to end taxation of American colonists without representation in the British ruling government. Now, let's take a look at how taxation without representation affected Americans all the way back in the 18th century. In the aftermath of the French and Indian War, which took place in the mid-1700s and gave the British more American land, the British government was in need of money to pay off their war debts. Great Britain decided to tax American colonies to pay off the debt, reasoning that American colonists were the ones who benefited most from the land gained in the war. One such tax placed on American colonies was the Stamp Act, which taxed all paper goods and was so named for the official stamps that indicated that the tax had been paid. Opposition to this tax from American colonists was so great that tax collectors were actually afraid to collect the taxes because of threats of violence towards them. Though the Stamp Act was eventually rescinded, it was replaced with other taxes, such as Townshend Acts, which taxed paper goods as well as glass and paint and more, and the Declaratory Act, which stated that Great Britain could tax the colonies whenever it wanted to. And this stirred up resentment in the colonists. Because the American colonists did not have representation in the British Parliament, except for Britain's policy of virtual representation, which stated that all representatives would try to represent all members of the empire, colonists found their taxation by Parliament unjust. The Intolerable Acts, which were more taxes levied on American colonists by the British government, were arguably the final straw for colonists, and these acts led to the creation of the Continental Congress. Members of this Congress would go on to write the Declaration of Independence in the Second Continental Congress, and later the Constitution, in which Washington, D.C. would officially be made capital of the United States. D.C. statehood, an issue of representation and autonomy, is a pressing issue today, reminiscent of America's War of Independence, all the way back in the 1700s. Like American colonists of old, American citizens living in Washington, D.C. are still fighting for representation in the government. That's all for now, and I'll see you in the next episode of History in the Headlines.